Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is TowerGate day number 1199. 1199. July the 23rd, 2020, Thursday. Thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, before I get started on today's video, just a note from yesterday's video when I was talking about Bruce Orr and Christopher Steele meeting twice in February. I said that was February of 2017. I actually meant to say it was February of 2016. 2016, not 2017. So got that date, got the year wrong. The date was correct, but the year was wrong. But the meeting did happen. It happened in 2016. So just a note from yesterday's video. Also, on today's video, if you have not watched the two previous videos from yesterday and the day before, you need to probably watch those videos, because today again is just a continuation of picking up on the theme from the video I began 2 days ago. That will continue through at least tomorrow and possibly even Saturday's video, because there's so much to dig into. And of course we're digging into this idea of the primary subsource of Christopher Steele, alleged primary subsource of Christopher Steele, the transcript that was released, and apparently we're told that Christopher Steele had a primary subsource, and that individual, there's been suggestions by several people that we know who he is, and that his name is Igor Danchenko. I do not buy into that. Igor Danchenko obviously is an individual. He's a real person. We're sure of that. But I don't think he was Christopher Steele's primary subsource. I think he may be involved. I certainly think he probably was involved. But I don't think he was Christopher Steele's primary subsource. He was probably some kind of a source for someone else. And of course, the revelations that came down yesterday from Chuck Ross, where he's reading this transcript of this court case in the UK between Christopher Steele and Alex Gubarev. We learned yesterday that shortly after Trump won the election, Christopher Steele contacts Strobe Talbot, who we of course know is a longtime, very close friend of the Clintons. He served in Bill Clinton's administration. He served in Hillary Clinton's State Department in a senior position. He's very close to the Clintons, has been for many years. He is considered a Russia expert. He was president at the Brookings Institution during the 2016 time period. It appears that some of these people who are being called the primary subsource, and some of his so-called subsources, also are people associated with the Brookings Institution. So this is the point that I've been drilling down on for the last couple days, and will continue for another day or two before we finally extinguish this topic for the near term. So you'll definitely want to watch the two previous days' videos if you did not. Otherwise, today's video may not make very much sense to you. Okay, so I want to mention just a couple things before I get into this. So if you guys will go back and look prior to the Horowitz, Inspector General Huckleberry Horowitz investigation, you'll go back and you'll find where the common term that was being used about Steele and his sources was that Steele had collectors who used intermediaries who used sources. Collectors, intermediaries, sources. That's what the narrative was for 2 years until the Huckleberry Horowitz report came out. And once the Huckleberry Horowitz report came out, the term collectors, intermediaries, and sources disappeared. And it was replaced with a new term, a primary subsource who had a handful of sources, 6. If you go back, and I remember very well at this time when I was digging into this and like everyone else trying to find out who these so-called sources, these collectors and all these other people were, it was kind of humorous actually, and you can actually do this for yourself on Google if you want to have a little fun. Go back, just type into the search bar, Christopher Steele collectors sources. And what you will find is that back in that time period, before the Horowitz report, the first original stories would come out early on. Christopher Steele used a collector who had intermediaries who went to sources. But as that narrative grew larger and larger and larger over a period of months, it went from a collector to a handful of collectors, then to a dozen collectors, then to dozens of collectors, then to hundreds of collectors. Steele had, by the time we got a year into it, Steele had this vast network of these deeply placed former Russian government officials who were collectors, and they had their sources and their intermediaries, and they made it sound like Steele had this massive web of collectors. Go back and look at the stories. You'll laugh your ass off. So now we've got the new narrative since the Horowitz report came out, that there was a primary subsource, and he had 6 sources. So I'm knocking that down. I'm calling bullshit on that right now. I believe if you want to say that Christopher Steele had any subsource or sources, that would have been Glenn Simpson. Christopher Steele, as best as I can tell at this point, and it's my belief, was nothing more than the guy who laundered the fake intelligence and then was essentially the salesman to go out and sell it. We know that the proto-dossiers were out there before Steele was even brought in. But the proto-dossiers didn't fly, so they had to come up with a new plan. Bring in Steele. Rework the proto-dossiers. Let Steele do a little copying and pasting. Let him work a few things around. But it was basically the same information coming from the same sources. And it now appears that the Rotten Reverend Clinton had reached out to her old friend, Strobe Talbot. And he seems to be, at this point, acting as if he was like Steele's handler. So we learned from the testimony of Mark Elias at Perkins Coie that he says he was traveling to Brooklyn every week to Hillary's campaign headquarters, where he was having meetings. He also says that he was directing Confusion GPS, who was directing Steele on what to investigate. And even this primary subsource, this what I believe is a fake primary subsource, is telling the FBI, yeah, well, Steele was telling me who to investigate, what to investigate. Which tells me that that this was cooked up after the fact. I think what happened is that once these people became aware that Inspector General Huckleberry Horowitz was doing this report, and they knew, a little brighter in here now, right? Fix my light. So once they realized that Inspector General Huckleberry Horowitz is doing this investigation, and they realize that they have Attorney General Barr sitting there knowing, having access to all the information, because Durham's working on it and other people working on it. They realize that Huckleberry Horowitz is going to have a hell of a time writing a phony IG report, because Bill Barr's supervising it, and Bill Barr knows the truth. So they knew that Huckleberry was going to have to come out and at least ways put out the facts as he and Barr and Durham know them. So Huckleberry wasn't going to be able to pull off the big cover-up. So I think that they realized that they had to do something, and I think they realized this very early on, as soon as Trump won the election. I think everybody started going into cover your ass mode. We get the Susan Rice cover your ass memo, and I think that this meeting here with the so-called subsource was totally a cover your ass operation. I have no doubt that that this subsource is, and his lawyer, by the way, are part of the deep state plot. They had to get together and cook up something to cover their ass, knowing that it would eventually come out and that they were eventually going to have to answer some questions about who Steele's sources were. Well, what are they going to say? Well, Steele's sources were actually, well, he didn't really have any. Glenn Simpson was writing the dossier with Nellie. And you had Hillary's henchmen, Shearer and Blumenthal, over there, and probably a couple people they know, digging up the dirt. It was all created, all on the inside. Steele was just there to sell it. And they knew they had to find something. They had to find some actual sources. So I think that they manufactured this guy, Mr. Danchenko, along with his sources. And I think if we dig in deep enough, we're going to expose these people as liars as well. Remember who's running the interview. Soma and his buddy. So the two deep state guys who are doing this interview are the same two deep state guys that have been a big part of they were part of the Crossfire Hurricane team. So they're the guys who are running this little game here. So this is why, and as I read through this and continue to read through this, let me fix this light here. This is kind of annoying. Okay, technical difficulty. I'm sorry about that. Technical difficulties with the lighting, but that's okay. We'll get through it. So yeah, I think that they realized that they were in deep trouble. It was a cover-up operation. I think as we dig into it, we're going to find out. And I don't know what Durham's looking into. I don't know what Durham's learned or anything else. I'm going simply off my gut instinct, which up to this point has proven to be pretty accurate. I smell a rat. I don't like any of it. I'm not buying into any of it. And I think that the guy who's actually going to turn out to be the main handler, the guy that was mainly kind of running things from the shadows for the Rotten Reverend, was our old friend Strobe Talbot. And so I think that that's the path I'm following. I'm not going to get distracted with the Steele subsource thing. And that's why we're going to go through. That's what we're going to do today. We are going to start going through the specific claims made by each source and talk about how the so-called subsource describes these people, just so you can see how ridiculous this is and why I'm telling you this can't possibly be true. I mean, these people are corrupt. They're not necessarily the sharpest knives in the drawer, but they are not this stupid. Okay? I'm just not buying it. So, before we begin on that, I just want to make a note that Devin Nunes was on Maria Bartiromo yesterday, and he was talking to her about the Spygate issue, and he brings up the fact that, it seems like from this deposition that Christopher Steele did in UK, he's talking about this person who was the president of Brookings Institution. He was in contact with him on a regular basis. He sent him the copy of the dossier. Well, actually, it was Talbot who requested a copy before Steele sent it, as we learned yesterday. Actually, we've known that for a long time. And then, of course, at the end, after Trump wins, it's Strobe Talbot who Steele calls to say, what do I do with the dossier now? So I think we're going to learn a lot more. And Nunes was telling Maria Bartiromo that he thinks it's time to start looking into the Brookings Institution. Of course, we know the Brookings Institution. People like Susan Rice was a senior fellow there. Of course, we had what's her name? Hill. Peter Schiff's star witness in the Ukraine impeachment hoax. Fiona Hill was a very senior fellow at the Brookings Institution at the time that Strobe Talbot is the president. Sharamella is closely connected to Hill. There are just too many people too connected there at Brookings with the Right Reverend Clinton, Talbot, and her peeps. This was all an inside job. So let's go through. One other thing I wanted to bring up as I was on this previous point, talking about Christopher Steele's so-called collectors, intermediaries, and sources, which the narrative which disappeared as soon as the IG report came out. There was also at a time there when hardcore anti-Trumper and Hillary lover and good friend of the Brookings Institution, former CIA Director Mike Morrell, had made quite a few comments when he was asked about it in several TV interviews he did. He said that he had learned that Christopher Steele had paid some of his sources. And this was reported in Vanity Fair. They quoted Mike Morrell from a couple of TV interviews where he says that he had learned that Steele paid some of his sources. Paid some of his sources. That's the old narrative. That's why Mike Morrell's busted. That's the old narrative. Because now we learn the new narrative is that Christopher Steele didn't have any sources. He had one subsource. And of course he was paying him. He worked for Orbis. He's already on the Orbis payroll. But Steele couldn't have been paying his sources because he didn't know any of these sources. He was told at some point by his so-called primary subsource who his sources were, but there's nothing to indicate Steele ever told his primary subsource to make payments to these people. And if he did, the payments weren't coming from Steele. Let's also remember that Steele, long time ago, said in his original deposition with BuzzFeed, in the BuzzFeed case, said that he never went out seeking the information, that it came to him. The information came to him. To these collectors. And these people he would describe as intermediaries between the sources. So the sources are telling intermediaries these things, who then go to Steele's vast array of collectors, and then the collectors are coming to Steele. Total bullshit. Total bullshit. And we knew it all along. Christopher Steele's a straight-up liar. And they're all lying. And they're not so much lying to cover the Rotten Reverend. They're lying to cover themselves. But, you know, if you go back and you look at the Clintons, and you look at a long list of the Clintons' friends, you'll find that most, if not at least half, if not most, of the Clintons' friends are either dead or in jail. The Clintons create these plots, and then they enlist other people to carry out the crimes, while giving themselves plausible deniability. So everyone else who's compromised either gets killed or goes to jail or disappears into the ether, never to be heard from again, while the Clintons go on with their devious plots. And this is what's going to happen in this case as well. Lots of people are going to go down. And they're not going to go down necessarily because they're covering for Hillary. They're covering for themselves. They got roped in and lured into a plot, and they committed the crimes. Hillary presented the opportunity for them to commit the crimes, and they took advantage, while she gets plausible deniability. The Clintons aren't stupid. They're corrupt as hell, but they are not stupid. So yes, Devin Nunes is correct to look into the Brookings Institution, and keep in mind when you're watching Devin Nunes, he's a very tricky character. He's a very slick character. I love Devin Nunes. He's very smart. He didn't drop Strobe Talbot's name. He didn't drop Fiona Hill's name. He didn't drop Susan Rice's name. He didn't drop Sharamella's name. He didn't drop any names in that interview. He just says we need to start looking into the Brookings Institution. Now, Devin Nunes knows exactly what I'm talking about. And I bet you, even though Devin Nunes didn't say it in that interview because it's not his style to get out ahead of things. But Devin Nunes is probably thinking the exact same thing I'm thinking, which is, you know what? Well, Devin, I was saying it 2 years ago, there were no Russians, and then about 6 months ago, you start hearing Devin Nunes say there were no Russians. I think Devin Nunes knows that this whole deal of a primary subsource, and he had 6 sources, I think Devin Nunes knows that's total bullshit. I think he knows it. And that's why he wants to press on Brookings Institution, just like I do. Because if you want to find the real people who are creating a lot of this garbage for the rotten Reverend Clinton, you're going to find that probably a lot of it was coming from the Brookings Institution. A lot of the people we just talked about, and maybe some others we don't know about, along with her henchmen, Cody Shearer and Blumenthal. And of course, Glenn Simpson and Nellie Orr. So I think that that's your sources and your subsources right there. But let's go ahead and play along, shall we? Now, to go through this, I'm going to be referencing the story written by Eric Felton at Real Clear Investigations. Eric Felton's done a great job covering Spygate over the past couple of years. I use a lot of his information in my timeline. We've talked about a lot of his stories before. And so he does a pretty good job of reading through the transcript and identifying each source and showing what each source, what information they supposedly provided, and some other interesting tidbits. Now, my take on all this is different than Eric Felton's, but then again, Eric Felton is a journalist who right now has to stay on the story as the facts unravel. He's not making, he's not at liberty to make the claims I'm making. He's just covering the facts. He's telling you what went down in the interview with the primary subsource. I'm going beyond that and analyzing what's going on around it. So I'm not discrediting Eric Felton by any stretch. Felton will get there when the facts get there. But I go ahead of the facts because I can do that. So anyway, just so you know, this is not a hit piece on Eric Felton. Now, let's start right here. I'm going to refer to these as the cover stories because I believe that the interview of the so-called primary subsource was a cover-your-ass setup. Cover-your-ass setup. So I'm going to refer to these individual little stories that we're going to go through as cover stories. And so let's just start at the very beginning with what Eric Felton points out, which is exactly what I pointed out on day one after reading the transcript, which is that this so-called primary subsource, Danchenko, did not have a network of sources. There was no network of sources. And he says that. What he had was a social circle of Russian friends, drinking buddies. And that's directly coming out of the mouth of Danchenko's lawyer. And I'm pretty sure that Danchenko wasn't paying his lawyer. Someone else was. And someone certainly briefed Danchenko's lawyer on a lot of things, which is what makes me think it was a major setup, one of the reasons. So we can go ahead and dispel the myth, even perpetrated by Inspector General Huckleberry Horowitz, continued to try to make us believe that there's this group of sources and subsources and contacts and all this kind of stuff. Bullshit. These are not a network of sources. That's according to the so-called primary subsource's own lawyer. They were not a network of sources. They were the so-called primary subsource's Russian friends and drinking buddies. So we learned that Steele, according to the primary subsource, had asked Danchenko, the alleged primary subsource, to look into Manafort. The problem is, as I pointed out yesterday, and Felton doesn't point this out, the travel records show that Danchenko was in Ukraine in April of 2016. Fusion GPS wasn't brought in until sometime in April. and Steele not until sometime in June, if you believe what we've been told up to this point. So if Debunking was in Ukraine looking into Manafort in April of 2016, he was doing it on someone else's behalf. Maybe Strobe Talbot. The primary subsource told Christopher Steele when he was asked to look into Manafort that he knew nothing about Manafort, didn't even know who he was. So he asked his drinking buddies. This is literally what the lawyer for the primary subsource is telling the FBI. He says, when my client was asked by Steele to look into Manafort, he told Steele that he didn't even know who Manafort was. So he asked his drinking buddies to see what they could find. And they could find nothing. They could find nothing. So Debunking, the primary subsource, alleged, dug up some old newspaper stories, open source research you might say, on Manafort, and fed them back to Steele. Of course, we know that Glenn Simpson did a deep dive on Manafort back when he was at the Wall Street Journal, along with his wife, Mary Jacoby. Of course, he needed some updated information, but fortunately, he had Nellie Orr. Nellie was hired in the late fall of 2015. Steele wasn't hired until June of 2016. The primary subsource was in Ukraine in April of 2016. That was a little before Fusion was hired, and therefore I'm calling this bullshit. So there you go. Here's how they try to cover his ass on this. Well, Steele told him to look into Manafort. He didn't know anything about him, had never heard of him, so he calls his Russian drinking buddies in his social circle to ask if they know anything about Manafort, and they don't. So he goes, well, okay, now we're told that the primary subsource decides to do what? Some Google searches to look up some old newspaper articles, and then he gives that to Steele. No, I think what actually happened is that, as I mentioned, Glenn Simpson and his wife had done a deep dive on Manafort, making him the poster boy for corruption among lobbyists, the lobbying for Russia. That was 10 years ago that Simpson and his wife did the deep dive on Manafort. And of course now they got Nellie Orr doing open source research. So I think the only thing they did was they took some of what Simpson and his wife dug up 10 years ago. They gave that to Nellie Orr, and they told her to get on the internet or do some open source research and find some newer, more relevant, updated information that they could package along with that garbage and pass it on over to whoever they were passing on to get it to Steele. And that could have been to Mark Elias. That could have been to one of Hillary's cronies. Could have been directly to Talbot. Maybe Simpson had been linked up with Talbot to use Steele, with Simpson on one end of Steele and Talbot on the other. Steele was fed the information, but it didn't come from his primary subsource. It came from Simpson and Nellie, and possibly Talbot and his friends over there at the Brookings Institute, which likely would have included Sharamella and Fiona Hill. That's what probably really happened. That makes a lot more sense. Then we get to source number 2. Source number 2, which we're 99% sure, is Sergei Milian, who of course denies ever being the source. He says everything they're attributing to me is just false. They're using me in this deal. I don't know why or how, but somehow, maybe I had a conversation with one or two people and I was unaware of it. But these things that they're saying are not things that I said, and I was not a source, would never have been a source for this garbage. I read you his statement 2 days ago. And you can go watch his interview on YouTube, where he deals with that issue straight up. But they are using Milian, I believe, as their so-called source number 2. Now, as you know, I've said I believe Sergei Milian. But source number 2, Milian, supposedly is the person who provided the PP-Gate story. The exact same story that the Right Reverend Clinton's henchman, Cody Shearer, concocted. Shearer then gave it to Blumenthal, who then gave it to Weiner, Jonathan Weiner, who then gave it to Steele, who then gave it to the FBI and Victoria Nuland, who then passed it along to John F. and Kerry, who, by the way, served in Vietnam, and then from Kerry, it made its way to the FBI. My guess is that through some sort of open source research, they discovered that Sergei Milian had pitched a real estate deal to Trump. Probably came up in their open source research. So they put someone onto Milian. They probably went and pitched him this PP-Gate story. He probably laughed it off. Said, I don't know. I mean, celebrities, who knows what they're into. I don't know. I don't care. I'm just trying to make real estate deals. And probably he may have said something, but probably joked about it or laughed or something. But either way, they just needed to have a contact with him. That's all they needed. And that's how he got snared into this thing. But the original lie probably came from Cody Shearer. But they couldn't, remember, nothing could come directly from Shearer or Blumenthal or Simpson. There always had to be someone in between them. And that's why all these people were cooked up and made up and created. To cover for the real sources of the garbage, which was all garbage, by the way. It was all coming directly from the Rotten Reverend, and she was directing every bit of this. Every bit of it. Steele said in his deposition that he did not know that Blumenthal and Shearer were friends and associates of the Rotten Reverend Clinton. He didn't know that Shearer and Blumenthal were friends of the Rotten Reverend Clinton. Steele knew that he was working for the Rotten Reverend. He was told that pretty early on by Glenn Simpson. Intelligence people, law enforcement people, whenever they get on a case, the very first person they investigate is the person a lot of times they're investigating for. They want to know everything about that person first. If you call the cops and make an accusation, they go back to the police station. The very first person they look into is you. The person making the claim, the person putting out the contract, the person doing this, doing that. You want to find out what their true motivations are because they're usually lying to you. You want to know where you stand. You want to make sure you don't get caught up in some bullshit. Detectives work the same way. If there's a murder, man and woman's in the house, man says, yes, someone came in, murdered my wife, I chased him, he ran out of the house. The very first guy that they investigate is the husband. That's the first guy they investigate. By his very nature, Christopher Steele should have looked into the Rotten Reverend. He should have known that Shearer and Blumenthal were working for the Reverend. When Jonathan Weiner gave him that PP-Gate story, he should have said, where'd you get this? Oh, well, I got it from a guy named Sidney Blumenthal. Your next question, who's that? These are natural questions you would ask. You're a professional in the CIA or British MI6 or FBI. These are questions you asked. Guess he wasn't interested. Because it never happened. Total bullshit. Well, I'm out of time for today. Join me back here tomorrow and we'll move on to the next source. Source number 3, which is even more entertaining. And we'll continue on for the next day or two till we finally get to the bottom of this. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back tomorrow with more TowerGate. See you. Bye.